The Korean Mafia boss, accidentally, runs into his 9 months, heavily pregnant ex working in a factory. The morning shift whistle hadn't yet blown at Seoul Industrial Bread Factory when Shin Min-ho stepped through the loading dock doors. Not just any businessman, the Shin Min-ho. The man who controlled everything from Buson's shipping routes to the underground casinos of Itaewon. The heir who made grown men confess their sins with nothing but a glance. He wasn't supposed to be there. This wasn't on his inspection schedule. But fate has a merciless way of orchestrating the most devastating reunions when we least expect the ground to shatter beneath us. Zendia Coleman had her back turned, sliding industrial trays of dough into the proofing ovens, the yeast and flour thick in the overheated air around her. Her beige cardigan stretched impossibly tight across her 9-month belly. The child within had been restless all morning, as if sensing the collision of worlds that was about to detonate. When the machinery seemed to quiet, not stopped, but muffled, as though the factory itself held its breath, she didn't immediately turn. Just called out over her shoulder in accented Korean, practiced from months of survival. Conveyor 3 is running behind schedule. But then the factory floor went silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that falls when a predator enters the kill zone. The kind of silence that makes even the steam from the ovens seem afraid to rise. She turned. Their eyes met across the stainless steel tables and flour-dusted air. Time collapsed between them. 8 months of separation evaporated in a single, brutal heartbeat. His dark eyes widened, first in recognition, then in shock so visceral it cracked through his legendary composure as his gaze dropped to her swollen form. He stood there in his tailored black suit that probably cost more than the entire factory's monthly payroll, tattoos creeping up his neck like declarations of violence, black leather gloves gripping nothing but air. Power and danger radiated from him like industrial heat. Zendia. Just her name. Just 3 syllables from his lips, but they hit her like a physical blow, like the slam of a furnace door. The metal tray slipped from her flour-dusted fingers, clattering to the concrete floor in a cacophony of destruction. Dough splattered across the industrial tiles like something pale and lifeless. The sound echoed through the factory like a gunshot. 8 months of careful hiding, destroyed in an instant. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice barely rose above a whisper, her hands instinctively moving to shield her belly, as if she could somehow hide the evidence of what they had created together in the shadows of his empire. As if she could protect this child from the blood-soaked legacy of its father. His eyes never left her stomach. The calculation in them, shock warring with something that looked dangerously like fury, or perhaps devastation. "Whose?" "Please leave." She was already backing away, her shoulder blades finding the industrial oven behind her, trapped between scorching metal and the man who'd once promised her the world before his family convinced her she was nothing but a disposable mistake. For the first time in months, the floor supervisor wasn't on the production line. No witness to this collision of past and present. No one to help her escape the gravity of him. He moved faster than anyone his size should. One moment at the entrance, the next his hand shot out to steady her as she swayed, light-headed from the heat and the shock and the weight of the child pressing against her lungs. His fingers circled her wrist, not painfully, but with enough controlled pressure to make it absolutely clear. She wasn't going anywhere, not this time. His touch burned against her skin, familiar yet foreign, a memory her body hadn't forgotten even after nearly a year of forced forgetting. The entire factory floor fell silent behind them. His men materialized at the loading dock entrance. She hadn't even noticed them arrive, standing like armed sentinels in their dark suits. The other workers froze mid-motion, trays suspended, conversations dying. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone understood the danger crackling in the air between them like a live wire. In Seoul's underworld, the Shin family name was whispered with equal parts fear and reverence. And Min-ho was their crown prince, more ruthless than even his father had been, colder than the patriarch who'd built the empire on blood and silence. And she had been his greatest secret, his most carefully guarded vulnerability. until someone made sure she believed she was nothing but a regret he'd paid to disappear. Welcome back, my beautiful souls and kindred spirits. Before we start, go ahead and subscribe, like, and share where you're watching from. It always warms my heart to see our little storytelling family stretch across the world. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you give helps us keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. So find your quiet place, settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've never been before. 11 months earlier. Zendaya had learned to read Shin Minho in the spaces between his words, in the way his jaw tightened when his father called, in the precise angle he held his whiskey glass when a deal had gone wrong, in the almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when she entered his office at midnight with files he'd requested hours before, knowing he'd still be there, alone with his empire and its ghosts. She wasn't supposed to notice these things. Executive secretaries managed calendars and screened calls and ensured the machine ran smoothly. They didn't catalog the micro-expressions of Seoul's most dangerous man. They didn't memorize which meetings left him hollow-eyed, which associates made his hands curl into fists beneath his desk, which family obligations drained something vital from him that even violence couldn't restore. But Zendaya had always seen too much. It was her gift and her curse. "You should go home," he'd said that first late night, not looking up from the contract he was annotating in precise red ink, marking territories, drawing boundaries, deciding fates with the stroke of a pen. "So should you." She'd set down green tea instead of coffee. He'd stopped drinking caffeine after 8 when she'd noticed the tension headaches, though he'd never mentioned them. He'd looked up then, really looked. Not through her, the way powerful men usually did with assistants, as if they were living furniture, functional and forgettable. But at her, into her. Something dangerous flickered behind his carefully constructed walls. "You pay too much attention, Miss Coleman." "You pay me to pay attention, Mr. Shin." "Not to me." But she did. She paid attention to the man who commanded an empire from behind mahogany doors, who signed execution orders with the same hand that straightened the silver-framed photo of his late mother, the only softness in an office designed to intimidate. She noticed when he worked until dawn before his stepbrother's board presentations, when he skipped meals before family dinners, when he returned from his father's compound with his shoulders carrying weight that hadn't been there before. She managed his schedules, but somewhere between the acquisition meetings and the territory negotiations, between the late nights and the careful silences, she'd started managing something far more dangerous. She'd started managing his humanity, protecting the parts of him the underworld couldn't be allowed to see. And Minho, for perhaps the first time in his carefully controlled life, had let her. 10 months earlier. The rain came down like a verdict the night everything changed. Gangnam's neon lights bled into the wet pavement outside the office tower, turning the city into something almost beautiful, almost forgiving. Minho had dismissed his security detail an hour ago, a decision that would have alarmed anyone who understood the precariousness of his position. But Zendaya understood what he needed wasn't protection. It was witness. "My father wants me to marry the Choi daughter," he said, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the storm. "Strengthen the alliance, purify the bloodline." The words tasted like ash. "He's presenting her next week." Zendaya's hands stilled over the keyboard. She'd known this was coming, had prepared herself for it with the same efficiency she brought to everything else, had already drafted her resignation letter, dated for the day after the engagement announcement. Clean exit, professional to the end. "She'll make an appropriate match," she managed, her voice steady even as something inside her began to fracture. "Appropriate?" He laughed, bitter and low. "Do you know what I did today, Zendaya? I ordered a man's execution because he betrayed my trust. I didn't hesitate, didn't lose sleep. That's who I am." He turned finally, and his eyes held something raw, something that looked dangerously like desperation. "But when you walk out of my life to make room for what's appropriate, I think that might actually break me." The confession hung between them like a blade. She stood. Every rational part of her screamed to maintain distance, to preserve the careful boundaries that had kept her safe. But rationality had abandoned her months ago, Probably that first night she'd brought him tea instead of coffee, and he'd looked at her like she was something more than furniture. Then don't let me go. They were married 3 hours later in a temple on the outskirts of Seoul, with rain streaming down ancient eaves and a monk who asked no questions. No witnesses except the storm. No announcement except the matching rings they'd found at a jeweler Minho woke with enough cash to guarantee silence. No celebration except the way he kissed her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning his entire life. It was reckless, dangerous, a union that violated every strategic alliance his family had planned. It was also the first real thing he'd ever claimed as entirely his own. 9 months earlier, the jade bracelet was older than the empire his grandfather had built, older than the blood oaths and territory wars, older than the violence that had carved the Shin name into Seoul's underworld with surgical precision. Minho's grandmother had worn it. His mother had died wearing it. And now he was fastening it around Zendia's wrist in the hidden apartment he'd secured for them, a sanctuary 40 floors above the city where his two worlds could never touch. "This belongs to the main wife," she whispered, understanding the weight of what he was doing. "Minho, if your family finds out." "Let them find out." His fingers lingered on her pulse point, feeling the rapid flutter beneath her skin. "Every alliance I've made has been strategic, every marriage proposal calculated, every relationship transactional." He lifted her wrist to his lips, pressing a kiss above the cool jade. "You're the only thing I've ever chosen that wasn't about power or territory or legacy. You're the only alliance that's mine." The bracelet caught the lamplight, ancient green glowing against her brown skin like a promise carved in stone. It didn't match anything about her, this working-class woman who'd clawed her way to his office through merit and midnight shifts, who spoke 3 languages and could dismantle his schedule or his defenses with equal efficiency. She was everything his family would never approve, everything they'd trained him to see as weakness. She was also the only person who'd ever looked at him and seen something worth saving beneath the crown prince of violence. "When your father presents the Choi Alliance." "I'll refuse." The certainty in his voice was absolute. "I'll burn every bridge, fracture every treaty. My stepbrother can have his pure bloodlines and strategic marriages. I'm done building empires on graves." He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "This is my empire now. You, this, us." It was a vow more binding than any ceremony, a declaration of war against his own legacy. Zendaya understood the magnitude of what he was sacrificing, understood that love in his world wasn't roses and poetry. It was choosing her over dynasty, over duty, over the only identity he'd ever known. It was making her sacred in a life where nothing had ever been holy. The jade was cool against her skin. His arms were warm around her. And for 3 perfect weeks, she believed they could survive anything. 8 months earlier, Minho's stepbrother wore kindness like a tailored suit, expensive, perfectly fitted, and completely artificial. He appeared at the apartment 3 days after Minho left for Singapore, flanked by the family lawyer and a woman Zendaya didn't recognize but whose eyes held the cold assessment of a professional evaluator, appraising threats, calculating vulnerabilities. "Miss Coleman, or should I say Mrs. Shin?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "My brother has always been impulsive, brilliant but impulsive." Zendaya's hand instinctively moved to the jade bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve. "Minho will be back in 4 days." "He won't." The lawyer stepped forward, sliding a folder across the coffee table. "He's extended his trip, meetings in Tokyo, then Hong Kong. He asked us to handle this situation in his absence." The documents were pristine. Divorce papers with Minho's signature, or something so close it made her hands shake. A cashier's check for an amount that would set her up for life. A non-disclosure agreement with penalties that would destroy her if she ever breathed his name. "This is a mistake," she managed, her voice barely steady. "Minho would never. My brother would never sacrifice everything our family built for a secretary he'll tire of in a year." The stepbrother's tone turned surgical. "He's already tired of you, Miss Coleman. Why do you think he left the country without telling you where he'd be staying? Why his phone goes to voicemail when you call?" She had called, 17 times, each one routing to static. He married you in a moment of rebellion, the woman spoke now, her voice clinical. Against his father's wishes, against family strategy, but rebellion fades, reality doesn't. She gestured to the papers. You were a pleasant distraction. This is your exit, take it gracefully. And if I refuse? The stepbrother's smile vanished. Then we'll discuss how executive secretaries sometimes have access to confidential information. Information that prosecutors would find very interesting. Information that could send you to prison while Minho watches from behind his lawyers. He leaned forward. You're an outsider who seduced her way into our family. A liability. A mistake he'll thank us for erasing. The jade bracelet felt like a shackle suddenly, like evidence of her own delusion. He gave you an out, Miss Coleman. I suggest you take it before we're forced to provide a different kind of exit. They left the check, the papers, and the dawning horror that maybe powerful men didn't change. Maybe they just pretended until the pretending became inconvenient. Present day, the morning before. 270 days of disappearing. Of becoming invisible in a city that never stopped watching. Zendaya had learned that survival wasn't dramatic. It was the daily arithmetic of which meal to skip, which shift to take, how many hours she could stand before her swollen ankles gave out beneath the weight of carrying Minho's child in a world that believed she'd been erased. The Seoul Industrial Bread Factory didn't ask questions, didn't require references that would ping back to the Shin Empire, just hands that could lift, backs that could bend, bodies that could endure the furnace heat and the pre-dawn shifts. She'd sold the jade bracelet first, tucked it into a pawn shop in Incheon where nobody knew the Shin family crest. The money lasted 3 months. The check sat untouched in a locker at Seoul Station. Blood money, proof she'd been right to run. She'd considered ending the pregnancy in those first hollow weeks, had stood outside a clinic in Suwon with the intake forms trembling in her hands. But her body had revolted against the thought, not from morality or sentiment, but from the stubborn belief that this child was the only real thing she had left. The only piece of Minho that his family couldn't forge or threaten or erase. So she disappeared into Seoul's industrial veins, moved every 6 weeks, changed her hair, her walk, her name on the factory rosters, became one of the invisible women who kept the city fed while remaining unseen. The other workers thought she was running from a violent ex. They weren't wrong, exactly, just incomplete. At night, alone in her rented room the size of a closet, she'd press her hands to her belly and feel the child move, strong, insistent, alive. Minho's son. She was certain somehow, the way her body knew things her mind couldn't accept. His son who would never know his father's empire, who would never carry the weight of blood oaths and dynasty, who would be free in ways Minho never was. She told herself it was enough. That safety was worth loneliness. That protecting this life was worth every vanished dream. Then the morning shift whistle blew, and she'd clocked in at the Seoul Industrial Bread Factory for what she thought would be just another anonymous day. Until the machinery went silent. Until she turned. Until 8 months of careful hiding shattered in a single, devastating heartbeat. Present, seconds that felt like lifetimes. Whose child is that? Not a question. A demand wrapped in the kind of quiet that preceded executions. Zendaya's back hit the industrial oven, trapped between scorching metal and the man whose world she'd fled. It doesn't matter. You have your empire, your appropriate alliances. I'm nobody. Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Minho moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the factory's confined space. Don't you dare use their words. Don't you dare tell me you're nobody when I tore apart Singapore looking for you, when I came back to an empty apartment and dissolution papers I never signed. The floor tilted. I never left you. His voice fractured on the edges. I extended one meeting, one. I called 17 times to tell you I'd be back early. The line was dead. When I came home, you were gone. Everything was gone except divorce papers with a signature I didn't write and a check I didn't authorize. His eyes burned into hers. So I'll ask you one more time, whose child? The truth stuck in her throat, 8 months of protective lies warring with the devastation in his eyes. Your stepbrother said you wanted me gone. Said I was a liability, a mistake you'd paid to erase. Something dangerous flickered across his face. Understanding, fury, betrayal of a different kind. What did he threaten you with? Prison. He had documents, evidence of things I'd seen in your office. He said you'd watch me burn while your lawyers. Her voice broke. I thought you'd sent him. I thought the marriage was just rebellion you'd grown tired of. I burned the Choi alliance for you. His hands shook as he reached for her, stopping just short of touching her belly. I fractured my family, turned down every strategic match, spent 8 months systematically destroying everyone who might have helped you disappear because I thought you'd chosen money over. The pain hit like lightning. Zendia gasped, her hands flying to her abdomen as something inside her seized. Not contractions. Too early, too sharp. Wrong. Zendia. Her legs buckled. The world tilted sideways. She saw Minho's face transform from fury to terror, felt his arms catch her before she hit concrete. Heard him shouting orders in a voice that commanded empires but couldn't stop her body from betraying the secret it had protected for 270 days. The baby was coming. And something was very, very wrong. The SUV screamed through soul traffic like vengeance given wheels. Minho cradled Zendaya in the backseat, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other holding his phone to his ear with the controlled precision of a man issuing death sentences while his world collapsed. I want every account frozen, every property seized, every ally contacted. His voice was surgical, emotionless, even as Zendia convulsed against him with another contraction that came too fast, too violent. My stepbrother forged corporate documents. That's fraud, embezzlement. Find it. Fabricate it if you have to. I want prosecutors at his door before nightfall. Zendia tried to speak, to tell him the pain was different now. Not labor, but something tearing, something wrong. But her voice drowned in the agony radiating through her body like shattered glass. Sir, the hospital, his driver started. Samsung Medical, obstetrics wing, call ahead, private floor, Dr. Kim. Tell her it's my wife, and if anything happens to her or my child, I'll burn that hospital to its foundation. He disconnected, immediately dialing another number. It's me, yes, the brother. I want everything he loves gone by morning. His mistress. Pay her to testify, his offshore accounts, drain them, his reputation, destroy it so completely his own children won't speak his name. Between orders, his hand found Zendaya's face, surprisingly gentle against the violence pouring from his mouth. Stay with me, just stay with me. We're 3 minutes out. Minho, she gasped, tasting copper, feeling wetness she didn't want to identify spreading beneath her. Something's wrong, the baby. His composure cracked. Just for a second, she saw the terror underneath. The man who'd married her in the rain, who'd given her his mother's jade, who'd chosen her over dynasty. Then the mask returned, harder than before. Nothing is wrong, you hear me? Nothing. But his hand was shaking against her belly, feeling what she felt, the unnatural stillness where there should have been movement. They hit the hospital entrance doing 60. Doctors materialized like Minho had summoned them from thin air. Maybe he had. Gurneys. Shouts. Hands pulling her away from him. The last thing she saw before the emergency room doors swung closed was Minho standing in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, tears streaming down his face while he systematically destroyed his stepbrother's life. Power had never looked so helpless. They wouldn't let him in at first. Hospital protocol. Sterile environment. He was covered in flower dust and her blood and the residue of 8 months of grief that had calcified into rage. But Minho had built an empire on making rules irrelevant. 3 phone calls and the head of obstetrics personally escorted him to the surgical suite where Zendaya was drowning. Placental abruption. Emergency cesarean. Blood loss. Terms that sliced through him sharper than any blade he'd ever faced in territory wars. The doctors spoke in percentages, survival rates for mother, for child, probabilities and complications, but all Minho heard was the possibility of a world where neither of them made it out alive. Sir, you'll need to stay back. I'm not leaving her. His voice was absolute, final, the voice that had commanded execution squads and negotiated ransoms. Now it was begging permission to hold his wife's hand while surgeons cut their son from her body. Zendaya's eyes found his through the haze of emergency anesthesia, terrified, apologetic, still trying to protect him even as her body failed the child they'd created in defiance of his entire world. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have trusted." "No," he gripped her hand like it was the only thing tethering him to sanity. "I'm sorry. I built an empire where my own family could threaten you, where you had to disappear to feel safe, where our son," his voice cracked, "where our son might not. He'll be fine." But she didn't sound convinced. Didn't look convinced as the monitors screamed and doctors barked orders and Minho realized with sudden, devastating clarity that all his power meant nothing here. He couldn't threaten death into submission. Couldn't negotiate with biology. Couldn't buy his way out of the consequence of 8 months where the woman he loved believed she was disposable. The first cry split the air like a miracle. Weak, reedy, the most beautiful sound Minho had ever heard. "A son," someone announced. "Premature but breathing, Upgar score." Minho didn't hear the rest. Just watched through blurred vision as they placed a tiny, furious creature on Zendaya's chest, red-faced and screaming, alive despite every odd stacked against him. Their son. Born from deception and separation and the kind of love that survived even betrayal. Zendaya's tears mixed with his as she touched their child's face with trembling fingers. "He has your eyes," she whispered. "He has your fight," Minho answered, and meant it as the highest praise he knew. 3 weeks later. The Shin family compound had seen many ceremonies, oaths sworn in blood, territories divided, successors anointed. But it had never seen anything like this. Minho walking into the main hall with Zendaya at his side, their son sleeping against her chest in a wrap the color of his grandmother's jade. The entire syndicate had gathered, associates from Busan to Incheon, allied families who'd built empires on the same violence that had forged the Shin name. And at the head table, Minho's father, his face carved from stone, flanked by empty chairs where the stepbrother and his co-conspirators should have sat, would never sit again. Minho had been thorough, methodical, the kind of destruction that left no room for resurrection. His stepbrother was in a federal prison awaiting trial for fraud that would keep him locked away for decades. The family lawyer had fled to Taiwan. The woman who delivered the threats had simply disappeared, the kind of disappearance Seoul's underworld understood without explanation. "You called this gathering," his father said, voice neutral, dangerous in its neutrality. "Speak." Minho's hand found the small of Zendaya's back, protective, possessive, a declaration before he even opened his mouth. "I present my wife, Zendaya Shin, born Coleman, and my son, my heir, Shin Jaiwoo." The name meant wisdom, deliberate, pointed. "Anyone who threatens them threatens me directly. Anyone who harms them signs their own execution order. Anyone who questions their legitimacy questions my authority." He paused, letting the words settle like falling blades. "I will burn this empire to ash before I let another member of this family touch what's mine." The silence was absolute. Calculation flickered across faces. Who would challenge, who would submit, who would wait for weakness? His father stood slowly, crossed the space between them with measured steps. For a moment, Minho thought he'd have to choose, family or dynasty, blood or throne. Then the old man looked at his grandson, really looked. Something shifted in his expression, not softness exactly, but recognition. "Your mother would have liked her," he said finally, nodding toward Zendaya. "She had that same fire, that same refusal to be erased." He placed a hand on Minho's shoulder. "Protect them better than I protected her." It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was permission. And in their world, permission was the same as benediction. Minho pulled Zendaya closer, felt their son's heartbeat against his chest. His empire, his real empire, the only throne that mattered. Untouchable, unbreakable. His. "Thank you for staying until the end. That means more than you think. If this story touched something inside you, subscribe, like, and tell me what you felt in the comments. I read every single one because this isn't just storytelling, it's connection. And if you're ready for the next journey, don't wander too far. The next story is already waiting in the dark.